How you doing? This is Kyle with Dirt Bike Channel. This is the Dirt Bike Channel podcast. Today we're going to be talking Sherco. So I realized that I put out the full review of the 2020 Sherco 300 SEF. I had the factory edition. I put out the full review on YouTube a few days ago, last week. I can't remember exactly. But I haven't done that here on the podcast. One of the things I like about the podcast format is I can be a little bit more long-winded. Just by nature of the way that podcasts work, I think people expect them to be a little bit longer. I listen to some of the podcasts I listen to are like 5 hours each. Other ones are shorter, but so I promise this won't be a 5-hour podcast because I've never done that. But I think the video review of this bike was somewhere around 20 minutes on YouTube. I'm not going to record this one for YouTube because we've already done that on YouTube. So this one will just be going out to podcast land. By the way, if you want to help this podcast, if you are a listener, it would really be helpful if you'd go and leave a review for the podcast. If you're listening to it on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever you're getting these things, if you'd leave us a review, that would be helpful. Helps to grow the podcast that way so that the algorithms know you guys think this is good content, and that would really be helpful for me. So if you haven't already done that, please go over and review the podcast. The other thing that you could do also to help support this is you could go to dirtbikechannel.com right now. If you're listening to this before December 15th of 2020, you can actually enter to win this Sherco. The bike that we're talking about today is one of my sweepstakes bikes for here in the late 2020 Dirt Bike Channel sweepstakes. So I'm giving this thing away. It'll also be going with, there's 3 bikes total that are going. So you've got a 2020 Sherco 300 SEF Factory. We'll be talking a lot about that today. There's also the 2 other 2020 KTMs. I don't have sponsors for this podcast. Originally, when I started it, I was thinking, hey, I will do the podcast as kind of an additional possible revenue stream down the road, and maybe it still will be, but I've been really lazy. I've been doing it now for over a year, the podcast, and I haven't seeked out any sponsors. I did have one company that asked me if they could sponsor a couple podcasts, and that was Fastway, and so they did. But I haven't reached out to anyone soliciting sponsors for this. So maybe that day will come, but I haven't. I've just been lazy. And the other thing that's kind of nice is if you don't have sponsors, then you don't have to talk about anything if you don't want to. So we'll see down the road. But I sponsor these podcasts because I'm the one who puts out all the money for this to do this. But I do love the podcast format, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, so why not? So today, let's talk about the full review of the 2020 Sherco 300 SEF Factory. So this is a 300 4-stroke, and it's an interesting bike. I wish that more manufacturers made a 300 4-stroke. Most of them really only make a 250cc 4-stroke and then probably a 450. But some of these brands like KTM, Husqvarna, Sherco, I think maybe even gas, maybe not gas on the 4-strokes, but they're making some different bikes. But the Sherco 300 4-stroke is one that I think Sherco makes it, and maybe the only other company that does this, a 300 4-stroke is TM Designs. I still need to get one of those eventually. I've never even seen one in person. So I've tried to kind of stick to bikes that are a little bit easier to get, a little bit more common. And Sherco is about as fringe as I've dared get so far. But we'll see. I mean, maybe we'll get a TM Designs eventually. Got to do it at some point, There's also some other bikes out there like the Chinese bikes and some different things. I don't have a ton of interest in those. I have to be completely honest, but anything could happen, down the road. So let's, but where I was going with that is the Sherco 300 4-stroke. I think if you said, Kyle, you have to have one bike for the entire year and it's got to be a 4-stroke, it would be very difficult for me to pick between this one and the Beta 390 RR that I had in 2019. Very, very very difficult to choose between the two, but I think it would be between one of those 2 bikes. I'd have to ride them back to back to know for sure because it's been over a year since I've ridden that Beta 390. In fact, it's pushing a year and a half now, and I really, really enjoyed that bike. And at the time I said, this is my favorite 4-stroke of all time. And it was super, super good. And then I've had a string of a couple of really good bikes, like the Yamaha YZ250FX. That bike is amazing. But it's better. It's really, really good in the fast stuff. This Sherco is kind of well-rounded enough that it's good. It's great in the slower stuff, better than the Yamaha. And I think maybe it gives up just a little bit to the Yamaha in the faster stuff. It gives up a little bit to the Yamaha and just the sheer, like, oh my gosh, fun factor. But it's just well-rounded enough that I think if I was going to do one bike that had to do all of it and it had to be a 4-stroke, it'd probably be the Beta, or the Sherco here, like the Beta 390 or the Sherco 300. I would buy this bike over a KTM 4-stroke. It's funny because a lot of people say that, Kyle, you're just like a KTM fanboy. I just really like the bikes that I think are the best fit for what I want to do. And in the KTM line, I don't think that there's a bike, 4-stroke bike, that I'd rather have than this Beta. Not this Beta, the Sherco. I've done that twice now. There isn't a bike in the KTM 4-stroke lineup. Like, I would take this 300 SEF Factory over the KTM 250 XEF. Yes, the KTM 250 XEF is super fun to ride, but it's not as well balanced. It's not as easy to go through the technical stuff on that KTM 250 as this Sherco 300 is. And I would certainly take this Sherco 300 over a KTM 350 XEF or XEFW. I like it better. I like what they've done with the motor better. I like how light and agile it feels. And that KYB front fork is pretty freaking awesome. It's pretty hard to argue against that. Now, KTM has some pretty awesome forks, but as far as like their air fork, I think that this one, I love the air fork on KTM, but this KYB fork, this is freaking amazing. And I haven't even done anything to it. You could even make this a little softer. I think that the 2020 Sherco 300 SEF Factory is the best valved front fork that I've had in at least a year, all the way around. And that's even with it being a little bit stiffer than what I want. I ended up backing the clickers on this thing, the compression clickers, all the way out, so it's as fast as it can get. And that's how I mean, it's been really, really good. So I had 4 bikes in a row kind of that had the KYB suspension or the KYB front fork on there. There was the 2020 Beta 390 Race Edition. There was the Yamaha YZ250FX. There's this Sherco 300 SEF Factory. And then my 2021 Kawasaki 250X. They all have KYB forks. And the Sherco is the one that is valved the best for me. It's just the best all-around valving that I've had. The only one that kind of missed the mark was the Beta 300, the 2020 Beta 300 Race Edition. That one totally sucked. And the others have been, like I've said before in other places, they've been variations of good to great on the other valvings that they've done. But it's a high spot to me. The highest spots to me on this Sherco are the front forks and the motor. And so we've talked about the fork just a little bit. The reason why I love the motor is because it just does, it's got like a gentleness to it that allows it to stay going, and just a smoothness to it that allows you to keep traction. And so it's this kind of like perfect little thing. And the first time that I rode the bike, for the first few minutes, I was a little bit underwhelmed because I had just come off of the 2020 Yamaha YZ250FX, and that motor is super snappy and just super lively. The Sherco isn't that. It isn't snappy and it isn't lively. It's just more smooth. And so it kind of feels like there were a couple times I was on the bike that it felt boring. It's not. I mean, but 4-strokes in general just feel a little bit more boring to me than the 2-strokes, if I'm dead honest. That doesn't mean they're slower. Sometimes it can feel like you were slower. I remember the first time, clear back in 2014, I'd been off of 4-strokes for a couple of years. I had a 2012 300 XCW and a 2014 300 XCW. Those are both 4-strokes. So it had been like a few years, 2-3 years since I had even ridden a 4-stroke. I remember back at that time, and I got the KTM 350 XCF, and it just felt boring and slow to me. It wasn't boring. It wasn't slow in reality, but it kind of felt like that. And I have... That was kind of the feeling that I had a couple times when I was riding this Sherco. It isn't boring, so don't quote me on that. It's not boring, but it's the best word that I can use. But what I found though after riding the bike, time and time again, and I could actually feel on that first ride is, hey, they've done some things here to really make this bike so that it just is rideable and it's just tractable and it just gets the right amount of power and it doesn't rip your arms off. And that's what Sherco was going for, and they did that really, really well. I think this bike, the Sherco 300 SEF Factory, tractors along as good or better than any of the other 4-strokes I've had. Maybe it doesn't tractor quite as well as that Beta 390, because the Beta 390 is a little bit bigger motor. But this bike feels lighter. The Sherco feels lighter, I believe, than that Beta 390. And so it's just a really, really great package. And I wish more people did the 300 4-stroke, It's pretty dang cool. Something else, and I already kind of touched on this, is the bike turns really, really quick. And this has been, because it's not the first Sherco 300 I've tested. I tested the 2017 model of this same bike. And they feel like the way that they set up both of those bikes from the factory, they are set up like ultra quick turning. The only problem with that is it kind of makes the bike feel a little bit unstable. If you're going to ride a lot of woods and it's going to be super tight stuff and the speeds aren't going to be high, like that's exactly what they've set this bike up for. They have not set this bike up from the factory, the two that I've had, they've not set them up to go ripping out through the desert. They've set them up to feel ultra light and to be ultra nimble and corner and quick turn and those types of things. And so that's something that they've done. Now, it's just a little bit too agile, a little bit too kind of skittish for me. And so on both of the bikes, I ended up dropping my forks down in the triple clamps. On this one, I dropped them down 3 millimeters, exactly 3 millimeters. And that was kind of a sweet spot for me. It still made the bike feel light, although it did feel a little heavier, but it just kind of slowed everything down a little bit so that it didn't feel like the bike was darting out from underneath me. And I really liked that. So that's something that you might want to do if you get your Sherco, is to play with the height of your forks. It doesn't matter if you even get the Sherco. Like any bike that you have, you should play around with that a little bit. Do a little testing. If you drop the forks down in the triple clamps, you're lengthening the wheelbase. That will make the bike feel generally more stable, maybe a little bit heavier. If you raise the forks up in the triple clamps, you're shortening the wheelbase, and therefore your bike is going to feel a little bit more quick turning, like some might say twitchy. So those are a couple of really, really great things. The other thing that I loved about the bike right off the bat, and it's just because it's one less thing that I had to do, is since it was the factory edition that I bought, it comes factory installed from the factory with a radiator fan. And so much of my riding has gotten, slower over the years. I've gotten to do more and more technical stuff, and it's really nice to have a radiator fan on the bike. The other thing that they did is they have a catch can to catch your radiator coolant. So if the bike does get hot and does start to overheat, it pushes it down into a catch can, which is kind of back in under the fender on the rear. So that's kind of a cool feature. It's the only bike it's the only bike I can remember that I had a catch can installed. And I've never put like an aftermarket catch can on my bikes, but it's something that some people will definitely do. So really, really cool. Some really good, those are my favorite things about it. Also being a factory edition, it comes with the Akrapovic exhaust, the silencer, which they give you 2 different spark arresters on that bike. So when you get your bike, you get your Sherco 300 factory, it's going to have a couple different spark arresters that you can put in there. So that's great. Other things that I thought were really, really good. The skid plate bolts to the frame. Now, it is an AXP skid plate, and they didn't do the AXP Extreme skid plate, which covers the linkage. I actually asked because I have a contact at AXP, and I said, how come you guys didn't give Sherco the skid plates that cover the linkage? And he's like, it was just a cost thing. They didn't want to pay for it. So Sherco was trying to keep the cost down. They wanted to include a skid plate, but it's not a skid plate that covers your linkage. So if you're going to be riding the bike a lot through nasty stuff, rocks and roots and whatever, you might want to get a different skid plate that covers that linkage. So just know that. So that's not like the best thing ever. I'm glad they have one for you. But the thing I wanted to point out is that something really nice that Sherco did, which not a lot of other manufacturers are doing, I guess it depends on the model, is that the skid plate actually bolts to the frame. It bolts right up into the frame on the front. KTM does that on their XCW. But on the rear, on a lot of these bikes, it just has like kind of a hanger that hangs over the rear of the frame. On this Sherco, there's a bolt that goes there in the back. So it mounts with 3 bolts. There's 2 in the front and then 1 in the rear, and it bolts right up to the frame, which makes it makes it way harder to lose those skid plates, and it's so nice, So those are some things that are really, really cool. We talked about the light feeling. We talked about the motor. Something else to mention about the motor. They give you in this bike, there's 2 different drain holes that have pre-filter drain holes for draining the oil. They have pre-filters down there, 2 of them, and then there's a magnetic filter drain plug, and then the paper oil filter. So there's some pretty good coverage there as far as protecting the motor. But let's talk about some things that kind of need improvement there, because the bike is not without those things. Anytime you get a review from anybody and it says, hey, there's nothing wrong with this, then the review is garbage, because nothing is going to be perfect. So while we're on the topic of oil changes, we need to talk about this. And I can also see that I've seen Sherco was aware of this, and they fixed it. On the 2020 model, at least on the 300, the oil filler cap was right under the hot exhaust. It's right under the exhaust. You can't even, if you're like on the bike looking down, you can't even see the oil filler cap because it's directly underneath the freaking header pipe. And it made it really hard to get that. It made it hard to get that out because your header pipe heats up to like 1,000,000 degrees within about 5 seconds. And it stays hot for quite a while because it's a 4-stroke. It's a thicker piece of metal there. And so it was kind of hard to get in there and, pull your oil filler cap off, because the bike is supposed to be warm when you're doing all this. When you drop the oil, it's supposed to be warm. And then let's say you fill the bike back up with oil, and you put some oil in there, and then you start the bike and let it run for 20 seconds, and then shut it off and look at your sight glass window, which is a cool thing. It's got a sight glass window there. You then notice, I've got to add a little bit more oil. Now you got to get that oil filler cap off, and you're like a half an inch away from this pipe that's going to be 200 degrees. And so it's easy to burn yourself there. That was just a total whiff from them. But the interesting thing is they fixed this for 2021. I have seen with my own eyes a 2021 300 SEF, and they changed the way that the header pipe is routed. And so they've basically eliminated this problem. It's nowhere near as much of a problem as it was on the 2020 bikes. So that's really cool that they're paying attention. Not that I did that. I'm sure like they didn't hear any of that from me. I have been complaining, but I think they had a solution for that in the works before I even realized it. So that's an interesting thing. The other part is that when you're changing the oil, you have to remove the skid plate, because the oil plug is on the bottom. The oil plugs, there's 2 oil plugs right on the bottom of the bike. I guess if you drilled your skid plate out, put some holes or something, then you could possibly change your oil without taking your skid plate off. But then you'd have a ton of oil caught there in the skid plate. I like it better when they come out of the side of the motors, the oil plugs, because that way you don't have to take off your skid plate. But that is something that's a little bit of an issue. Oh, and then here, get this one. So in order to take the skid plate off, you've got an 8mm. You need an 8mm socket for the bolts on the front, and then I think it's about like a 4mm hex key, an Allen wrench that you're using to take out the one bolt that's on the bottom, kind of holding the what do you call it? Your skid plate up there. So now you've got 2 different tools. Now, if you want to do your oil filter, which I only do the oil filter Probably every other time. I only replace the oil filter about every other time. But now and then to take out those 2 bolts on the bottom, the bolts, I think they're, 14s. So now you're up 14 millimeters. It's either 13 or 14. So now you're up to 3 different tools that you need. And all you've done is take off the skid plate and then drop those, your oil plugs, oil drain plugs. Now you want to take your oil filter off and replace the oil filter. Now you've got to take out 2 more bolts because you have to take off your chain guard. And underneath the chain guard, underneath the plastic chain guard, then there's a metal chain guard on there, which is another Allen wrench. And then you need, I can't remember what it is. I think it's a 17 millimeter then to pull off that oil filter cap. So you're pulling off you're using like 5-6 different size tools to get this all to change your oil. I just think it's a little bit excessive. I think they could, standardize some of those things so that you're not taking off so many things just to change the oil. As a side note, like people say, hey, changing oil is easy and it only takes you 10 minutes. I time everything I do. The people who say that you can change oil in 10 minutes, they're totally lying to you because you have to start the timer when you go out there to, as soon as you start to get your tools out and get the bike out, the timer has to start. And by the time you take the tools, get the tools out, get the bike in an area where it can warm up, and then drain the oil in a place where you're not just like draining oil all over your lawn or whatever. And then by the time you get the oil filter back in and clean up all this mess and make sure that it's topped off and double check that it's topped off and clean everything back up and spray off the bottom of your motor or wipe down or something like this and put everything back away and do something with that oil, like put it in some sort of a container so that you can recycle it later. By the time all that happens, at least 30 minutes have gone by. And it takes time. This is one of the reasons why I don't like messing with 4-strokes as much, is it just takes so much time. It's going to be between $20 and $30 every time you do an oil change. Now this isn't just on the Shercos. Like this happens on any of the 4-strokes that I've had, but it takes time and money, and it's just more difficult. It's just more work. The other day I was changing the oil on my son's 85, and I was changing the oil on the Sherco. And I mean, I'm out there with tools and, rags and all this stuff and funnels. It just takes a long time. And so that's just kind of a little bit of a tangent for me to say, I wish that Sherco would make that a little bit easier so you don't need like 5 different tools just to change your oil, So the rant is done on that one. Something else that's a little bit that needs to be addressed on the Shercos, it's really easy to bend the radiators. There are some bikes that I've had in the past that it would be really easy. You could like tip the bike over one time and then your radiators would be bent. Some of the manufacturers have figured out how to brace those things better just in stock form. Sherco needs to do that because it is so easy to bend the radiators on these bikes. You're going to have a radiator brace, a radiator guard of some kind. And I was even running Bulletproof Designs radiator guards when I tipped the bike over one time. It bent the radiator guard, it bent the radiator back, and I had to replace the radiator because now it was leaking. Like suddenly the radiator guard didn't fit anymore. The radiator was bent enough that it was leaking, and I had to replace the entire thing. Now, interesting side note here, the radiators for the Sherco were made by WP. Because I bought a radiator from my dealer, had them drop ship it, which is another topic that we can talk about. They drop shipped the radiator to me. I can't remember. It was less than $100. It was the left-hand radiator. It was right around $100. The right-hand radiator, I think, is even cheaper, or somewhere right around there. The interesting part is you can replace both radiators on these Shercos for less than the cost of buying radiator guards. And this has been like something that I've been dealing with for a while, because this is basically across all the bikes. If you if you're running radiator guards, I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing because it's insurance against, maybe ruining a day out there. But in this case, the radiator guard didn't even save my radiator from needing to be replaced. Just something to think about. So there's something that they need to do. I don't know exactly what it is, but if they brace them somehow different, because they give you a stupid little radiator louver on this Sherco that is ridiculous. It's this little flimsy, brittle piece of plastic that is only like a louver that might, keep some mud from going in the radiator, but it offers zero bracing at all. They rattle. They're kind of ridiculous. And so if you get a Sherco, which I highly recommend. I said at the beginning of this, I'd buy this Sherco 4-stroke over like almost everything else except for maybe the Beta 390. But you're going to have to get something different to guard your radiators. And it's probably going to have to be some decent radiator brace guard, like a Bulletproof Designs or a Flow Motorsports one or a Trail Tech one. Or I'm not really a fan of the ones that just have the back straps, but you're going to have to figure something out though. So. The brake pedal on the Sherco sticks out really, really far. It just does. Like the pedal just kind of comes out a long ways away from the motor, and I think it's too far. I was really, really careful with mine, and full disclosure, I didn't do like really any hard enduro style stuff with the Sherco. Because it's a 4-stroke, it isn't my favorite thing to do on a 4-stroke, get into the super, super nasty stuff. So I didn't bend the rear brake pedal. But I just feel like it sticks too far out. I wonder if there are some decent aftermarket options for that for you to play around with. I should also mention here, parts. So it's it's definitely harder to get parts for a Sherco than it is for some of these other bikes out there that are a little bit more common. What do I mean by it's harder to get them? Because you can get parts. There's not as many aftermarket parts for a bike like this because companies that are making aftermarket parts, they have to kind of decide, hey, where do we want to spend our resources? And they're probably not going to spend a ton of their resources working on, on parts that aren't like the ones that they can easily sell. And that's one of the issues that you have with like a Sherco or a Beta or a TM Designs or a Gas. Now it'll be maybe easier to get stuff for Gas because it's owned by KTM and a lot of those parts are going to be interchangeable, but you get what I'm saying. You can get parts actually quite easily through the dealer network, though. So the dealer that I purchased this from is Moto Experts in Spanish Fork, Utah, and they're fantastic for getting parts. In fact, they've even got one of their guys there, Cameron. He's one of the store managers, the shop managers there. I've talked to him. He'll be perusing Instagram or whatever and see somebody that needs a part. See somebody that broke something or whatever, and he'll reach out to him and say, hey, do you want me to drop ship that part to you? Sherco should be paying him to do that because it's a great way for, to build rapport with customers or whatever. But the Sherco dropship program is pretty nice. I do have one gripe with it. And it's one step more that a consumer has to do. I can't just look up the part numbers. There's no place that I can go, at least not that I'm aware of, where I can go as a consumer and direct order the part. You have to go through the dealer. Now, if you've got a good dealer, this isn't going to be an issue, but you've got to describe to the dealer which part you need, and then they'll be looking it up on their network, on their network websites, whatever they use. They'll look up that part, and then they can order it, take the payment from you, and have it drop shipped to you. So it happens pretty fast. It's not as fast as if I can just go to Rocky Mountain ATV and order a part for any of my other bikes, like my Kawasaki or my whatever. It takes a little bit longer to get these parts drop shipped to me, but you can get them. So you're not going to be able to get it like the next day. Like for me, for instance, if I break something on a KTM or anything that is stocked at Rocky Mountain ATV, which most of the Sherco stuff is not, if I order it now on, before about 3:00, I'll probably have it on my door the next day. Or at least, in 2 days. But because some of these larger retailers, Western Power Sports, Rocky Mountain ATV, they're not stocking hardly any stuff for these Shercos, that means you're going to have to go through the dealer. It's going to take a couple of extra days. So if you're just riding once a week, this probably isn't going to be a big deal to you, because let's say you break something on a Friday or a Saturday, you call up your dealer that day or maybe on Monday, you can get that ordered and it might be drop shipped to you by Thursday or Friday, hopefully, cross your fingers. So that's just something so the drop ship program works really good, but it's just going to take an extra couple of days. And I wish I could just look the parts up on my own. If there was some, website that was easy to go to, where I could be like, hey, this is the part I need. I can look it up on, some microfiche or a diagram or something. I would prefer that. But then the dealer can sell the part, and it helps, the dealer network and blah, blah, blah. So they're probably not that interested in changing that right now. The grips, they use a very, very hard, stiff compound on the grips. They did the same thing on the other two Shercos. This is the third Sherco that I've purchased. And all the Shercos that I've had have had a really, really hard compound on the grips, and I don't like them. I replaced them. On my bike, I got from Rocky Mountain ATV. So there are things you can get off like some of these websites. Like I got aftermarket foot pegs for the bike. I actually maybe bought them straight from Fastway. I think I did. I got different grips for the bike, So there are some things that you can get, handlebars or something like this. Oh, here's another thing, like your levers. Your levers, they use a Brembo brake and a Brembo clutch, so it's the same lever that you would buy for like a 2020 KTM. It's that same lever that you can put on the Sherco. I know because I bent one of my levers. I bent my clutch lever the last time I was out on the bike, and I just grabbed one of the ones that I stock in my shop for the KTMs. I just threw that right on, and it worked perfect. So that's an interesting thing, is some of those parts are interchangeable. We already talked about the skid plate not covering the linkage. Here's an interesting thing. So the bike, when you're starting the bike, you at first, with all the other 4-strokes that I've had, if you don't give any throttle. The EFI 4-strokes are, you don't give any throttle of the bike, and then it starts. A lot of times, if you even have the throttle cracked open at all on most of these other 4-strokes, the bike won't start. You guys know what I'm talking about. On this one, there were times where I was like, dang, this thing isn't going to start. It would crank and crank and crank. Once it got hot, I'm talking about. So I'd be out in the middle of a ride, and then I would, hit the starter and just crank and crank and crank and crank. There were times where it would crank for 6 seconds before it would fire. And I was like, dang, this is not good because it doesn't have a backup Kickstarter. After a while, I figured out it's just like the old carbureted 2-strokes. You need to crack the throttle open a little bit. When you crack the throttle open a little and then hit the starter, boom, the thing fires to life really, really quickly. So that's just something to note about the Sherco. If you've got one, crack your throttle open as you're roll the throttle open just a little bit as you're grabbing the electric start button, and the bike will start a lot better. Bump starting. I thought something was wrong with my bike or whatever because it would not bump start. If basically what happens is once the ignition decides to kind of power down or whatever, which takes a minute or two, the bike will not bump start. You can go down the longest hill ever and the bike will not bump start if the ignition is off. All you need to do, and I thought that it would turn the ignition on by the time it got some torque, it started to roll, everything started moving, especially once you drop the clutch and start dragging that motor over. I thought it would turn everything on, but it doesn't. So you just have to kind of hit the starter button there for just a second. That wakes the ignition up, and then the bike will bump start immediately. So if you stop on a hill and you then start rolling and try to bump start it within 10 seconds, 30 seconds, it will start. It'll bump start like just fine, just like any other bike. But if you wait too long for the ignition to cut off, you got to bump your starter for just a second, which kind of defeats the purpose of even trying to bump start, because if you're going to bump the starter, you might as well just stay going on the starter. So that's just kind of a little bit of an annoyance to me. But it is something to mention. The plastics also needing improvement. The plastics on these Shercos are it's a little bit more brittle than a lot of the other things out there. More brittle than the Yamaha. It's more brittle than the Husky. It's more brittle. I don't know if it's more brittle than the Beta. The Beta and the Sherco are actually pretty brittle plastics. They break easier. They just break easier, especially like the handguards. They use some stupid compound on the handguards where they break easier. So I've now, for this bike to be given away, I've actually just put some KTM handguards on the thing. Literally the KTM handguards, because it's a Brembo. They're using Brembo brake and Brembo clutch, and the KTM handguards and the Sherco handguards screw right into a mount that goes into those handguards. Into the Brembo brake and clutch. So I'm using some handguards from my 2020 KTM. They're black, so it kind of matches. My 2020 KTM 300 XEW, I've now got that installed on my Sherco. I'm going to give that bike away like that because I broke the stock Sherco handguards, just the flag guards. So that's something to note. Something else that was kind of frustrating is when I went to, because I had to replace the radiator. I took my tank off, the fuel tank, and the coupler that they use to remove your fuel line. First off, you get sprayed in the face, and they even say this in the manual. They're like, "Hey, you better put on some eye protection or whatever, because you're going to get sprayed in the face when you pull out your fuel coupler, your fuel line out of the fuel tank. It's all pressurized, and it's probably going to spray you in the face." And so, I put on some eye protection, and then boom, it did. It sprayed right up in my face, and it's not easy to uncouple that without breaking the little plastic clip that they have. They basically just say in the manual, "Hey, push here and pull here and it'll come apart." And it does, but I broke the one that I had just getting it apart. And so I had to order that. It wasn't super expensive, but it was just an annoyance, because if you pulled your fuel tank off and you broke that, which is easy to do, now you're out of commission for 3, 4, or 5 days until you get another one of those, from the dealer. So just keep that in mind. Be very careful. It needs to be improved. It's not the greatest way to uncouple the fuel tank from that fuel line. I don't like that, and I wish they would change that. Something else that really kind of sucked. This one sucked. I melted my pants on the pipe twice. I melted 2 different pairs of riding pants on the pipe because it sticks out far enough right down by your knee. They had a guard there. They have a guard on the 2020 model. It doesn't come back far enough to protect you against melting your pipe. They did change that for 2021. I know that because the pipe comes down on a different angle. And so I think it would be much harder because they removed the pipe guard on the 2021 completely. But because it comes down at a different angle, I don't think it's going to be an issue. So I melted 2 different pairs of pants, which kind of sucked. Just some other things, and I talked about this on the review. The stock pegs come out flat on the Sherco. So on every other bike that I've had, probably since the last Shercos, I wish I could see my 2017 Shercos. It's amazing the things that you start to realize over time as you do this more and more. So every bike that I've been able to go back and see pictures of, dating back to 2018, 2019, all the bikes that I've had, all the foot pegs come out at an upward camber, upward angle. So if you look at the bike from behind, your peg comes out, and the tip of the peg, the outward projecting tip of the peg, is higher than where the mount is. That's an upward camber. On these Shercos, they come out completely flat, dead flat. So what does that do as far as what does that translate to on the bike? For me, it means that I feel less locked into the bike, because with that upward camber, it kind of forces you, it kind of like locks you in on the bike just by the way that the mechanics of our feet and our knees and our legs are. When we've got something that's a little bit upward cambered like that, it just locks us in. It forces, our skeletons on our bodies to be more locked in on the bike. Your feet don't slip off the pegs, and it just makes it easier to hang on to the bike. And that's something that you don't get that feeling on the Sherco. It's more of like, and I don't know if this is like something that they do in trials bikes a lot, but both the trials bikes that I have an upward camber. The Sherco trials bike that I have has a little bit less of an upward camber than the gas, but it still does have a little bit of an upward camber. So I'm kind of at a loss for that. I don't know why the pegs come out flat. So I ended up buying some expensive Fastway pegs that were $200 that allow you to adjust the camber. They also allow you, on those pegs that I got, they also allow you to shift the pegs down and back, which was nice, because for whatever reason, I just feel a little bit more cramped on the bike when I'm riding this Sherco. I feel when I'm out riding it, I get into the attack position and I feel totally fine and everything feels great and I'm going and I'm flowing and everything. But I noticed it time and time again that the next day, the day after, 48 hours later, my lower back was more sore on this bike than it was on the other bikes that I was riding. It was just like clockwork. And so how I counteracted that is I moved the bars forward to give myself a little bit more room, but I had done that in the beginning. And then once I got those Sherco, the Fastway pegs, I was able to move the pegs down and back, and it's only about 10 millimeters, maybe a centimeter or so. But that did help me to feel a little bit less cramped, help me to feel a little bit more opened up, because I feel like the pegs on the Sherco stock, I feel like they're a little bit higher. Now it gives you some additional, clearance, but not a ton, because the bottom of the bike, you've got the bottom of the frame down there anyway. So moving the pegs up doesn't technically give you more overall clearance. It might mean you hit your pegs a little bit less on things, but it just kind of made me feel more cramped. It made me feel like my feet and my hands were closer together. So I would be sore, and it just takes a little bit more of a toll on me. And that's something that I noticed with these other bikes. I was more sore after riding the Sherco than I was after riding the Yamaha. And I was more sore riding the Sherco than I was riding the KTMs. And even now, I can even say that with the Kawasaki, I am in its stock form, I'm less sore on the Kawasaki on the 2 rides that I've had with the Kawasaki than I was on the Sherco. So would I take the Sherco over the Kawasaki for an all-around performer? Yes. But that's after I know I can move my pegs a little bit. I can do some of these things. So that helps. Something else that I have noticed is that the clutch pull on the Sherco is a little bit heavier. It is, as near as I can tell, it's the same parts, like the clutch master cylinder, the clutch up on top, up on the handlebars. That's the same part number as like it is on the KTMs. And even on the Beta, as near as I can tell. So I had, 3 bikes in a row or whatever that had that same clutch. It's like a number 10, Brembo clutch. They must use stiffer springs in the Sherco, which you would think, and that would explain for why it's a heavier clutch pull, which you would think would make that clutch feel a little bit better. But I don't feel like, I feel like there's a little bit more fade. I feel like the clutch isn't quite as durable on the Sherco. I haven't burned out a clutch, but I just don't feel like it has quite the durability as some of the other Brembo clutches that I am used to riding in the last little while. So just something to kind of pay attention to there. So those are my thoughts on this bike. Again, if you come back to the top, if we take this from the top, is this a bike that I would recommend? Yes. Is this a bike that was the most fun mountain single track bike that is a 4-stroke bike that I've had? Yeah, it's freaking awesome for riding around in the mountains. It was my bike of choice if I was riding with my boys, because I needed to put some time on it, and it was fun to slow things down. You could find things to hit. You could find things to play around on. It was fun. The only problem with riding this bike with my boys is I couldn't share gas with them. Of course, I can't share gas with the boys on my KTM TPI bikes either, because I don't premix those. So I would carry fuel with me when I was, out on this bike, and the fuel was, mixed gas for my boys. So I had a ton of fun with the bike. Highly, highly recommend it. There are no deal breakers on this bike. There's no reason not to buy it. And in 2021, I think the thing has gotten better. Oh, one other thing I should mention is it vibrates more. So this 4-stroke vibrates more than any of the 2-strokes that I have in my shop right now. So it just, for whatever reason, it's got a little bit more vibration than the Yamaha YZ250 FX. It's got more vibration than the Kawasaki KX250X. It's not a lot, but it's more vibration and you feel it in your hands and in your feet. It's more vibration than I would expect to have on a 4-stroke. So, okay, so that's the full review of that Sherco. Guys, thank you so much for listening to these podcasts. Again, please go out and rate and review this podcast. It helps for people to find it. The other thing I would say is, guys, if you haven't, guys and gals and whoever is listening, if you haven't entered to win this bike, you got to go do that. If you are listening to this before December 15th at midnight of 2020, you can go to my website, dirtbikechannel.com, and you can get entered to win this bike and the 2 other KTMs that I'm giving away. All of them are late model 2020 KTMs. You can get yourself a hat, a shirt, a hoodie, whatever, and that really, really helps to support this channel. It's one of the ways that I'm perpetuating this business model going forward, is by giving these bikes away to you guys. So hopefully that is of use to you, of interest to you, and leave a single track. Thanks, everybody.